Hello and welcome to another episode of the CG Garage. This is episode number 453 featuring Peter Sohn, who is a director over at Pixar, and he recently directed the amazing film Elemental, which was really cool to see. And I was, it was just kind of amazing to hear him talk about it. I talked to him about it at the View conference about a month ago or so. And it was such a great thing to meet him because he is so kind and so thoughtful and such a great listener and so generous with his stories that he was able to tell. This story is very much a story about his personal life growing up as a son of an immigrant in the United States, and sort of hearing how that takes place and how it's being sort of illustrated through these elemental parts of the story. And really incredible. He's got a long history at Pixar. He's done many things, including story and a bunch of other things, including being a voice actor. He is, in fact, the voice of Emile on Ratatouille. And the character of Russell on Up was actually modeled after him. And if you watch the video, you will definitely see how that happened. A really nice guy. And I really enjoyed it. What I think I appreciated the most is after listening to him tell the story about Elemental and his own personal life, I started to really think about movies and how they are become a self-reflection about what we are and what we do. And you guys know I'm a big cinephile, and one of the movies I love to talk about on my other podcast, Martini Giant, is Saturday Night Fever. And I definitely felt a connection between Saturday Night Fever and Elemental because of being that immigrant and trying to sort of understand how to get out of this neighborhood in some ways. Really interesting to think about that. Of course, Elemental is not quite as dark as Saturday Night Fever, but we learned through the podcast that it almost was because Peter was going through some difficult times during the directing of this that sort of had him have to force a change to be able to get things out of his system. Really interesting. You'll just listen to the podcast. You will see what he has to do. It's a very emotional one. And honestly, one of my favorite ones of the year because of how candid and kind Peter was with his stories. So thank you so much, Peter. Okay. This is, I know we are, for those in the United States, hopefully you guys had a good Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving is just this last week. And of course, we're going into the holiday season. Things are a bit slower in terms of our announcements. We're not necessarily doing any big events and coming up right now. And we don't necessarily have any big new product announcements just yet, but we will, of course, have those coming up. But I do, in terms of announcements for this week, I'd like to mention again, I think I mentioned it last week, that we just passed 9 years and 450 episodes for the podcast, which more specifically means that next year will be 10 years and 500 episodes. And for the next year, I'd like to sort of brainstorm with you guys to think about what we could do for that celebration. What could we do for 500 episodes? We do have a year to plan for it. And I'd like to take that year to plan something big and exciting. So I'd really like your input in terms of what could we do? How could this be exciting? Do we have a special guest? Do we bring back some guests? Do we have a live event? And what all of those possibilities are. And if you have ideas for something big and you have an idea of how to make that happen, we would love to hear your suggestions. So go ahead and email us. labs@chaos.com is our email. Again, labs@chaos.com. And email us all of your suggestions for that big event. But also if you have other suggestions of other guests you'd like to have more immediately, we'd love to hear those as well. So you can always use that same email for that as well. All right. And if you guys are new to the podcast and you're like, oh, okay, I want to know what's going on over the last 9 years or so, we have lots of episodes that you can check out, including some incredible guests. So you can always go to chaos.com/CG Garage. Again, chaos.com/CG Garage. And if you'd like to follow us on social, we are on Facebook, facebook.com/CG Garage Podcast. And if you'd like to watch these episodes, they're along with all of our other Chaos videos. It is at youtube.com/Chaos Group TV. Again, youtube.com/Chaos Group TV, where you'll be able to watch all of the episodes in video form as well. But for now, please enjoy episode number 453 with Peter Sohn.
Welcome to another CG Garage, where the Chaos Group talks. You'll know it's over when the last bucket drops. We're gonna fire off rays in high dynamic range. We know that ambient occlusion is passé. Global illumination won't lead you astray. And while image-based lighting is really swell, you need to make sure everything has Fresnel.
Well, listen, thank you for being on. This is really fun. I loved your talk today.
Thanks, Chris.
And it really sort of resonated a great deal with me, sort of understanding what it was. And I saw Elemental, obviously, as well, and sort of getting to that. But what I think what got me so excited about your talk is that a lot of times when I do this podcast, I like to talk about people's origin stories, and that whole film is about your origin story.
Right, right, sure, yes. Yeah, look, I never thought that it would make something so personal. It just grew into this thing that, that when you're doing something creative, you always feel like you've got a goal, but when it starts to shift, you make the choice of, do I force it to be what it is, or do I allow it to grow? And boy, it went somewhere.
Yeah. What was the thing that really drove you in this? Obviously, I'd like to know how you got into animation. Actually, that's actually an interesting story. Like, how did that happen?
My mother is a cinephile.
Oh, really?
But she grew up, during the Korean War. Her dad was an electrician and in this poor village, but he was the electrician to the theater. And so my mom would go to the movies all the time as a kid. And, she loved Gary Cooper. And so she, when I was growing up, anytime the grocery store that my parents had made money, she would take us to the movies. And
right.
That triggered a love for me for, the theater. But it was an animated movie that I remember my mom getting very emotional at, that sort of got me more into it. And in elementary school, I just started making flip books, and that idea of persistence of vision and what that was. I mean, I didn't know what was
the feature.
It was Dumbo. And there was a moment where, the baby elephant is being held by the mother's trunk, but she's been imprisoned.
Right.
And there's a song. Most of the movies that my mom took me to, she didn't understand English, so my brother and I were always translating these movies for her. So it was always like, that's what's going on here in our terrible Korean. But in Dumbo, she did not need any sort of translation whatsoever. And I didn't know it at the time, but looking back on it, I just remember like, wow, what an effect she had on me, because that was her passion, was just loving these stories. But then, there was a book called The Illusion of Life that I saw in a library, and in the corner of it was this flip book where you went from Pinocchio to Pluto, and you would just flip, and this idea of frozen images being flipped through, creating that optical illusion, blew me away as a kid. And so I just kept making flip books forever until I had enough money to make a short film in high school. And from there.
What was your short film about?
It was about a kid getting mugged. I grew up in New York, and in the storefront, this little kid wanted some candy, and this kid mugs him. I mean, this criminal mugs the kid. And,
right.
But it was half finished. It was all analog. I had done it on paper. I was like in the 10th grade, and I had saved enough money to buy celluloid, acetate, and I would ink and then paint, then wash them and do it all again, and shot it on a 16 millimeter Oxberry camera, and in New York at a school. And I remember sending the film away, and a month later getting it back, and
it takes a whole month.
Right. Yeah. And then all of a sudden, like, the blip of the animation that I had done shocked me, of like the amount of work that you did to get this little amount of screen time. But from then it's just been a lot of homework, and then these lucky connections to get into some studios.
Yeah. What led you to Pixar? How did you do that?
So I went to CalArts, and
nice.
to learn animation, 2D animation.
Okay.
That was still going, and then about the end of or the second year, DreamWorks had just opened up their animation.
Yes.
And Warner's did too. And Brad Bird had a project called The Iron Giant that he came to the studio and he pitched what he was doing. And I remember a lot of the other studios were very corporate, and there was a sort of circus to it where Brad came in and he just talked about Lady and the Tramp and what he loved about it. And I remember that feeling of like, oh, this is what it means to be a part of a tribe. He's talking the way we us students were talking. And,
right.
Some friends gave him a call and just say, is it possible to get lunch? And we had lunch with him and asked him questions about his history. And then a few of us got jobs from there to work on Iron Giant.
Did you know Ryan Woodward?
Yes. Oh my God. Do you know Ryan? Oh
yeah, I
God.
did. I just did a podcast with him recently.
Yeah,
and he was just talking about that.
Oh yeah.
Which is awesome.
Yeah, but like that style of filmmaking that he had sort of imparted to that crew was so much about putting, like, using all of the buffalo and
right.
and every piece of them, everything that we are working on has to be up there. We can't waste, and being passionate about performance and story.
Yeah.
It wasn't a Hollywood thing in terms of like, oh, we've got this Hollywood big name, let's give him more lines or give her more lines. Right. It was just such a sincere love for the craft.
It's such a beautiful movie.
Yeah, he did a tremendous job,
Yeah.
and that being sort of the first film for me, I was hungry for that, and I was like, I would follow that. Like,
sure.
Our next film, Osmosis Jones,
Yeah.
was a very different philosophy. It had 4 directors on it, 2 live action, 2 animation directors, and it was a much more commercial process.
Mm-hmm.
And juxtaposing those 2 experiences led me to Pixar. Those guys, Brad, having worked with him, got my name up at Pixar for animation, but I just didn't have enough experience, so they denied me, and I came back down. But I left my portfolio there, and Ralph Eggleston, the production designer there, saw my portfolio and then asked me to interview, and then he brought me up onto Finding Nemo. And so that was my first show. But so I did a couple years at Warner Brothers, a year at Disney TV, and then went up to Pixar.
That's amazing. What were your responsibilities on Finding Nemo?
I started as a sketch artist, meaning I was designing the parts of the dentist's office and some of the third act set pieces. And then Andrew Stanton noticed that my the way I would do the set drawings were very much like story images, essentially comic panels.
Right.
And then so he brought me into the story department, and so I had done some of that art for a while, and then into the story for the rest of that film.
Right. And you've also done voices and a bunch of other things.
Yeah, look, I never thought I would be doing it. I went in to do 2D animation,
right.
And so the idea of storyboarding came a little bit more naturally because I liked the pose of it.
Sure.
But then the next movie on Iron Giant, having worked with Brad, he gave me these amazing chances to go into the art department, then into the story department, and then in the animation department, and then gave me a chance at doing some scratch voices for some things.
Right.
I was a mugger in that movie, and just tremendous luck with the opportunities he gave on that show, and then it's been sort of bouncing around that for a lot of the films.
Sure. Well, I love obviously a lot of people that come out of story end up directing and things like that. So it's kind of wonderful. But I do want to go into detail about Elemental because I think it's a great story. I love stories like that. The story it reminded me of, which is a little bit different, was one of my favorite films, which is Saturday Night Fever.
Oh yeah, I love that movie too. Oh yeah.
And it just has that little bit of that gritty New York and the little, different worlds scenario that was really kind of resonates. But this movie specifically was way more personal about, like, the story of your parents coming here that's very similar to what that story is, right?
Yes. And what was interesting was the inception of the film was about just thanking our parents for the sacrifices that they had given. That was really, the heart of it. I would talk about it, about like understanding our parents as people and what that meant. There's a certain age that happens to a lot of us where we really start to realize their decisions that they had made, versus it being some sort of autobiography.
Right.
I never wanted to go there, and it's really not an autobiography, but that resonated with so many members of the crew that the film sort of evolved because of all the stories that everyone was telling us to this universal idea of what it means to be a foreigner or an immigrant, and what assimilation or acculturation can be, because it sort of naturally fit in this diverse world of elements, and it sort of became that it started becoming its own thing.
Sure.
But in the middle of this production, my dad died and my mom died toward the end of it. And that's where something else shifted in the way I was making this thing with the team. Was I was so afraid of doing anything personal, because I knew that once you go there, it's so hard to make objective decisions, because you're just thinking like, oh, that's the feeling, it has to be this. And it was something I never wanted to go into. So I really relied on the crew and their experiences as well. But because my parents had died, it just basically became, I didn't know this at the time, I can say that now that the film's done, but that it was just a way to honor our parents.
Right.
Their stories, obviously it's an animated film, a fantasy film.
Sure.
But finding specificities that a lot of the crew folks could hook into that felt real to them,
Yeah, because I remember, when you were showing your presentation, I didn't know that, for a long part of the film, he was running an incinerary shop, right? Which is very different. And then you decided to shift it to make it, a much more mom and pop store, which is much closer to your reality, right?
Yeah, that's where it goes more in the autobiography place.
Right.
Yeah.
So it was interesting that took place in that way.
But the choice for that, maybe it subconsciously was, but it was really trying to understand Ember and her issues, and processing my dad's death,
Right.
like that angry version of. There was a version of the film that was very angry and dark, but that stemmed clearly, looking back on it now, from losing my father.
Right.
But then trying to not see the anger anymore of the death, and trying to remember the positive of his life, and that clearly shifted what that relationship with the daughter and father would be. So that from that garbage incineration business to this mom and pop shop, it was all about making connections. The garbage business couldn't form connections because you're not serving a customer face to face.
Right.
And there was a lot of people in the show that all understood. They all came from families that had retail or shops like that.
Okay.
All of a sudden, that idea of trying to connect to a customer became clearer,
Yeah. What was that thing that sort of led for you to change the way that you think of that character? Because were you angry at I know you mentioned several times that you were angry, but what were you angry at your father for dying? Were you angry at the situation that was there? Did you not have the opportunity to express how you feel?
It was several layers, Chris. It was, it was a surprise the way he died, and there was certain issues in the way that he died that broke my heart, that I was really frustrated about. But then it was also the politics in the country were shifting. They were getting much more polarized, and there was all this news articles about immigrants and keeping them out of the country, and all this stuff that happened right when that hit a fever right when my dad died. And so there was a mix of all these layers that were sort of hitting me. And then doing a film about immigrants, all of a sudden there was this burden of like, we have to talk about this, and I have to honor my father and his experience. which took it into this very angry place.
Right.
But it was those layers.
Yeah, I can understand. I think it's very hard to digest things, especially because I think, right now, social media almost honors anger over other things.
Yes, the algorithm really loves it. Yeah, it really
and it's
does.
really sad. But I think it's some amazing stuff about it. So I remember when I was watching your presentation, you were talking about, the picture of your parents arriving from Korea.
Yeah.
Very, very similar
Yeah.
to that story. But then how did it get to elements? You mentioned you saw the periodic table. I thought that. But was it really that transition, or was it like we needed to be about something else? How did it become about that?
Right. So the timelines are all sort of messed up. Like that periodic table thing was just the gag that I did when I was in school. It wasn't anything. There was no, it wasn't about the classical elements. I would just draw a lot of characters coming from, helium was real gassy. It was all sort of these jokes.
Right.
But that's all it was. It was just jokes.
Right.
And so when I got, so then years later, I went to this event where I got to thank my parents.
Yeah.
I brought that anecdote back to the studio.
And you were already slated to do a film with them? Or?
Yes,
Okay.
they were asking for me to pitch a couple ideas, but this wasn't even a pitch. This was me they were as friends talking about like an experience that I had with my parents that I got very emotional, thanking them for the sacrifices they made for my family.
Mm-hmm.
And that was something that was pretty unanimous. Like, that's the heart of your film, Pete. And so, but that had nothing to do with the elements. It was just this little nugget of a feeling of gratefulness. But then when I started developing the story, I was researching all this stuff. Then that little gag of the periodic table came to mind. The idea of a diverse neighborhood and world that were living on top of each other,
right?
And how they could sort of mix and not mix, sorted like perfectly fit with that little feeling of nugget with my parents. And then in the development of that came boiling it down to the classical elements.
Right. So how was that development going as you were starting to think about things? Why did you pick fire and to be the primary one?
It was so interesting when you're writing, there's free writing when you're just flowing and write whatever is sort of like the stream of consciousness, just letting it flow out. I do the same thing with drawing, and so I'll just draw and just see where the hand takes you. And there was fire characters that were drawn, this little family that just came out of nothing.
Right.
And it really brought to me like, I feel personally connected to this for some reason. Why do I feel like this? And that the fire is dangerous, and is the perception of me growing up in New York, where you were, the xenophobia of you not wanted, sort of with a very thin thread started connecting to that. But then in terms of researching fire, it was an amazing thing. It's not really an element. It's a change agent fire, right? It's a plasma, right? It's the classic elements were just such funny, like non-logical, illogical forms.
Sure.
But that you could still make a community out of a change agent really was interesting. That it could change the other elements.
Sure. Became
a little craw in my mind of like, this feels like what a protagonist needs to be.
Right.
To be able to shift the world around it, and that's how that started.
Yeah. What was it like directing simulations?
Chris, I didn't know enough about it. I came in with a lot of hubris. It's hard to imagine what was it like before the film, but there was no characters made of fire or water. It was hard to find. There was Calcifer from Howl's Moving Castle, a 2D fire.
Right.
And then there were characters that were on fire in live action movies, like the Human Torch, Ghost Rider, these type of things. And at Pixar, we had done Jack that turned onto fire. So there were those sort of peer
references.
References.
Yeah.
And so when I would talk about like, there's this fire family, no one really knew what I was talking about. It was like, meaning people on fire? Or like, no. Like, are they actual fire? Yes. Are they like candle flames? Like, no. Until I started drawing some version of it. And so when drawing it, I had a lot of confidence in like, oh, I feel like I've got something that we can then translate into the computer. It'll take some work, but we'll get there. Controlling a simulation was a thing that I really didn't understand. Like, because the teams there and the other movies that I work with had shown their simulations. We had a river in The Good Dino, and so much of it was just about letting the physics do what it needs to do.
Right.
Versus having it emote something or control it to feel an emotion. That part of it was one of two of the biggest hurdles of the film.
Right.
The film took 7 years to make. Part of the reason why it took so long was that Pixar didn't have a pipeline to animate or build characters like this. And so we had a lot of R&D for a couple years just to go, what are they going to look like? And then what are the tools that we need to build to control all of that? And that part took much longer than I thought it would ever take.
Right.
And, that was one of the hardest things.
Especially like the fact that, fire looks like fire, but it's a stylized fire in a lot of ways. And you said you used some machine learning tools to make that happen. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I guess I'll take a little step before that.
Sure.
To your point about like it doesn't look like fire, but it is fire. Like that was a real interesting challenge because the computer easily could create a realistic fire to a certain degree.
Sure.
Like there was tests that were done where it was just essentially putting in a couple of like ingredients in terms of temperature and height and speed, and there was real fire. It didn't look like a body, it didn't look like a creature, it just looked like fire. Now that it was great because that's what the computer does well, is makes something photoreal. When you looked at it, you could feel the heat coming off of it. You felt like, oh yeah, that could burn something.
Right.
Then we were looking at 2D fire, really abstract graphic fire, and it looked cool, but it didn't look like it could burn you. It didn't have that effect.
Right.
And so we were trying to find the balance between those two things, which is how we got to the NST, or the neurostyle transfer, the machine learning of controlling that simulation. Anytime we put the eyes and the mouth on her, realistic eyes demanded realistic fire. Right. And it looked terrifying. It looked like the Balrog coming out of, Mordor. It was really scary looking. And you could if we needed to make a horror movie, we've got that, no problem. That was going to be easy to do.
Right.
But to try and find a landscape of a face that you could watch for an entire film and sort of fall in love with or empathize with, that's where that balance was the challenging part of it. And so we sort of put the more graphic sort of caricatured eyes onto realistic fire, and it just didn't fit.
Right.
Until they figured out a way to carve that simulation into a more graphic thing with the NST. And that's when it started to find a balance.
Right.
But the tough thing, as hard as that was, we didn't want the fire character to feel like it came from a different movie than the water, earth, or air.
Of course.
And so that design of Ember sort of forced the design of the other characters.
So you started with Ember as the thing that drove everything else,
yes,
right?
That's right. Ember was our first character. She wasn't the hardest though. Wade was the hardest character.
Because it's so transparent. Right?
Yes, everyone said going in that water was going to be the hardest, but I didn't believe it. I thought fire would be.
Right.
As hard as Ember was, by the time we got to having those tools to control the simulation, and by the time we got there, we had just begun on Wade, and we were hitting obstacle after obstacle because of fire has no shadows.
Right.
The connections of appendages didn't have seams. There were no folds. There was nothing.
Right.
The fire could, once you turned it on, it could cheat so much of it.
Right.
And I didn't know that's the cheats that could come with fire.
Sure.
With water, there wasn't really cheats.
Right.
That's, like if you tweak the sim motion of the water in one direction just slightly, he would just turn to jello immediately.
Right.
If you went the other way, he turned to Casper the Ghost.
Right.
Like it was this really tightrope balance of trying to make sure that he felt like caricatured water. I mean, like you saw in the presentation, we had very clear wades where you just saw right through him, and he was refracting everything like a lens naturally.
Right.
And when you see that, everything in the back, even though it's blurry back there, when it's inside his body, all becomes crisp. So the background brick wall was crisp in his face.
Right.
And so we had to start making graphic choices to cheat what water was for us.
And you gave him some volume, basically, and some color, right?
Yes, that's right. So there was sort of this murk in him and a sort of a plasma or prismatic sort of aberrations that were going on inside him to give us the effect of, like a pool at night.
Right.
And
you had bubbles too.
And we had bubbles and we had ripples going through the surface and simulated waves for his hair. But all of that was tough, but the lighting of him was one of the hardest things.
Right.
Because he was so reflective and refractive that in any sort of situation, every sequence and every shot, he just didn't look like what he needed to look like.
Right.
Like, even though we had a set standard sort of shading color to him and a look to him, when you would put him in a dark room, it would all disappear. Embers of light, she was the same in every situation.
Right.
And then if you put Wade out into the noon lighting in broad daylight, he would blow out the lens. He would just become this white ghost that was walking around, and controlling that shot to shot on top of controlling his expression and his model was very difficult, because in some angles he looks really weird and gross, and then in some angles he looks really cute. Trying to balance that with the lighting was he was a monster.
Yeah. And you mentioned you had 151,000 computers or something.
Yes, that's right. They had bought several more, knowing the trouble that we were into rendering all of that.
And that was mostly due to the water and stuff?
Yes, it was the water characters.
Wow.
And that sequence I was showing in the presentation where he's stepping into water that's pouring out of these culvert doors, and he's growing because the water's filling him up. It was explained to me, because of those layers of transparencies, that the computer has to render all of it, and it's taking forever.
Right.
And it was that sequence, and then the air stadium sequence with all the crowds and simulated air characters that were moving around. Simulating all those air characters hit us hard, and so that's when they made the choice that we're going to need more cores.
That's amazing. That's amazing. I want to get a little bit into the culture of the store, because I think it was really cool.
Yeah.
Once you're in the store, you see everything that's a little foreign.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
A little bit different, like what they eat, what they buy, what they are doing. There's all fireworks, all these different things. What were you thinking about in terms of your own different culture, and how that influenced, like, this is something that I have in my culture, and they'll have something like that. Were there some correlations between those things?
Yes, there were. Yes, there was. And there was two sort of philosophies in trying to figure that out. One was about disruption.
Okay.
And then one was about redefining what being a foreigner was.
Okay.
And so we had this unique culture that we were building, and the hope and the intent was to build something that was unique wholly to fire, that it wouldn't be connected to any one culture.
Sure.
As we did that, it got very generic. There was, anytime we hit a specificity into something like, that's that culture, we can't use it, or that's that culture, we can't use it.
Right.
And so it just became, they like to eat wood, and they like to burn. Like, there wasn't a lot more that we could add that we could connect to as an audience. So the first philosophy of disruption became something that we used, of like, okay, what if we take something that is from something that we know, like a bow, like in the Korean culture or Asian culture, what that means. Then we sort of evolved it into a more fire sort of bow. So it wouldn't represent an actual bow that any one culture would do, but we still took the gesture.
Right.
But then another tradition we would take from another culture, and shifted so that anytime you would, there was a shirt that said "Kiss me, I'm Firish," and so it was like, oh wait, I thought they were Asian, but are they Irish? What like there was a lot of disruptions that we kept trying to do. Now the perception of it was a mixed bag. Some audience was like, oh, they're clearly South Asian, or meaning my job of trying to make that as universal as possible wasn't always successful. But it was that mix with the fun of what's fun about fire, and their language is made up of the cracks and pops of like when you hear a roaring fire at a campfire, meaning that wasn't connected to any culture, just that's what fire does.
Right.
And so there was that philosophy. Then the other one on what was I saying? There was disruption and what the hell was I just saying? Disruption and I'm forgetting. My brain is slipping here.
It's okay. I was going to ask about the creation part of it, like the fact that she can blow glass.
Yes, that there are many forms of that. She was originally a graffiti artist.
Oh.
She was, again, in that dark version, she was sort of a vandal, and she was very rebellious against the culture of the city.
Right.
And but again, it got so dark. But I went to an iron forge where they had glory holes and everything, and just watching that act of someone blowing glass was so inspiring that I just started drawing. What would that be if you didn't need gloves and you didn't need all those apparatus to just do it by hand? And so that was just triggered from a little bit of research and exploration.
Yeah. You mentioned a story of who was able to sort of get you out of that darker version?
It was my executive producer, Pete Docter. He has been through it before. He's, tremendously creative and just a really great, empathetic, objective ear.
Sure.
Meaning like he's not jumping in and watching everything. He's not micromanaging. He's there to see where the milestones are and offer really fantastic objective viewpoints. By that dark screening, it was so dark. Everyone clearly was like, it started off all fine and it was a really fun idea. But then after my dad died, there was a clear turn that I couldn't even see. And Pete had sort of pulled me aside and asked, is this the movie that you always wanted to make? And I was like, no, I wanted to do something hopeful, Pete. And and we had a good conversation, and then it came down to him reminding me of something that I pitched to him. And was this one line that the dad says to his daughter about this misunderstanding of something, that the shop was never the dream, you were the dream. And we both got very emotional over it, because at the heart of it, it was just this love story between this daughter and her father.
Yeah.
And that brought me back to why I was doing this all from the first place, just thanking my parents. And I had lost that when I was, after my dad had died. And so it wasn't just that one little anecdote. There was a lot of care that he gave through the process of making sure the film needed what it had, and that I was still able to be objective, because he knew that when it got that personal, the danger of just being stuck in like, no, it has to be this. And for myself, I would just continually blow ideas up to not allow myself to just fall in love with something, but there were still things that I did fall in love with that I got very stubborn over, but he was always there to sort of keep me on track.
Yeah, I think that's really amazing that you were able to do that, because did it help you get through it, redoing it?
It really did. Meaning, even if the film wasn't an autobiography, I didn't need to. It was the crew and Pete and everyone. We all knew how it started. It was all about this very sincere appreciation, for people in our lives that took risks for us, and that sort of was coming in at all angles. And it was cathartic because it was a form of support. They were supporting the film and supporting me going through something. And it wasn't just my mom, my dad. It wasn't just my dad. My mom died several years later, and all in this production. And the whole fucking movie was about trying to thank them,
Yeah. I think that's really, it shows so much, and it really is kind of wonderful for sure. I also love the anecdote story you said about your Korean grandmother dying. You're Korean.
Yeah. Oh, it's so real. Yeah.
Tell that story.
Yeah. So when, this was college days, my grandmother, was a very strong Korean.
And then was she in the U.S. or was
She was in New Jersey, yes.
Okay.
And when she passed away, she had brought us all together, and she had said, in Korean, like 한국 여자하고 결혼해, which is marry Korean, and she passed away. And it was like, but I had fallen in love with someone that wasn't.
Right.
And so there was this tremendous guilt from that, and bringing my now wife into the family brought so much culture clash that connected to so many other people on the show, and we were all talking about ideas, and there was sort of this universal get from this group that started forming this story, but it came from a very, very real place.
I think it's really, really interesting. So you've obviously, you've been working on some animation since Iron Giant and all of that stuff going to now. Obviously, animation is changing quite a bit.
Yes.
What are your thoughts about the changes that are taking place in animation and how things are going?
I am two of minds of it. Like, I love the diversity.
Right.
I'm just very excited about the breadth of animation. Like when I was starting, it was like one or two studios,
Right.
and then there was not very much in between. And now we're at a place where there is so much, and so there's so many viewpoints to see, and so many new styles and new narratives that are just very exciting.
Sure.
At the same time, though, like what it's doing to theatrical experiences have been really fascinating, and still something that I'm trying to process in terms
Right.
of, like, there's so much content that's coming out in animation on streaming, and now there's more for the theater now than ever before.
Sure.
And I love the animation community. I never see it as a competitive thing. It's just trying to get audiences excited about movies now are so much harder when the choice is like, oh, I'll just wait to see it on streaming.
And you only need to wait a couple months.
Right. And across the board this year and parts of last year, you can just feel it. Like live action movies and
Right.
animated movies.
Yeah.
That there is this shift that's happening. And I don't know where it's going, but I grew up loving the theater like most all of us.
Sure.
And that sort of belief that when a group of people are together in a room and sharing emotion, there is a palpable chemistry shift that's happening that you just don't get when you are by yourself watching something.
And can hit pause.
Right, and can get paused to go get your popcorn or your microwave Hot Pockets or whatever it is.
Yeah.
But the movie industry's still going great. I mean, there's so many big movies.
Sure.
There's just, like there was the mid-range movies that are going away now. And now there's different aspects of choices that are being made that I still don't quite understand yet that is concerning.
I understand. I think there's going to be a paradigm shift in filmmaking,
Yeah.
which could be a good thing at some point.
Yes.
Because I think that people need to see that there's new things that can be done.
Yeah.
I'm excited about the fact that there are films like Elemental and animations like Elemental and animations like Arcane.
Yes,
that
absolutely.
can be all shared experiences.
Exactly, I'm with you. Exactly, like that diversity is incredible.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really important. Do you think there's something also interesting that's happening with style of animation?
Yes, as much as the diversity of narratives, I think the diversity of styles, because it's it's a technology-based form of filmmaking,
Right.
with Moore's law and like the speed at which technology is evolving. Things that used to be hard are getting easier, and so
Sure.
that means those tools are being opened up so that we can try new things. And the interesting thing is that, like, being nimble to shift styles is a very exciting thing, but sometimes at a large studio it's harder to shift a moving cruise liner, you know what I mean, like when
Yes.
they are used to a certain style. And so I think Mike, the head of effects on Spider-Verse, said it at a panel today about, like, so much of his job feels like trying to break the pipeline, which was very much what we were trying to do in Elemental, because shading a car or a toy is
Plastic.
Pixar's bread and butter,
Right.
for so many years. Trying to do that with essentially an effect or a simulation was so difficult, where maybe we could have found simpler tools to get there. But
Right.
having it go through the big machine of Pixar just, it was hard.
Was hard, yeah. But there are styles. I mean, that's the thing that I think is so wonderful about something like Elemental is you look at it and you can tell this doesn't look like Toy Story.
Right. Yes. And I mean, I really appreciate that it's something that we were aiming for. But there's still so much further that, these films can go. All of the films out there.
Right.
From Disney's history of going from Snow White to Cinderella, and then from Cinderella to Sleeping Beauty, then to 101 Dalmatians. There was an evolution of just those artists just continually to explore the medium. And the exciting thing about right now is that there's so many groups of artists that are exploring the medium that as these processes get more optimized through machine learning or generative AI or whatever,
Right.
There will be more styles that, hopefully support the stories that they're aiming for, but it's exciting.
As a creative, you mentioned generative AI just now. As a creative, and you guys also used similar stuff
Yes.
with the neural transfer.
Yes.
As a creative person, what do you think about that? How do you think about those use cases? Just the fact that people are going out there and using AI
Yeah.
to make themselves look like a Pixar character.
Yeah, right. Again, it's the optimist in me is very excited by it, meaning there's just so many opportunities to get technology into more hands.
Sure.
That part is really exciting. And then also optimizing a lot of the hard work that
Yes.
animation is. We were talking about 2D animation where you would just take forever to get a second of film. AI has the power to optimize so much of the work in all the departments in a way that will open all of those artists, I think, to be even more creative.
Sure.
The fear of losing one's job is the major fear that you talk to about with everyone.
Right.
From where I work. And again, I think it's just about trying to understand the language of it.
Right.
When I was working with the tech teams, I didn't know the language. And so much of it was scary.
Right.
But once you started learning the lingo and what each department did and what each program did, but between Houdini and some of the proprietary software Pixar, you just didn't know it coming from the art world. And then once you learned it, it wasn't scary anymore.
Sure.
And I feel like the same is true for AI. There's so much that it can do that we just don't know that people are afraid of. But then the more that we learn about it, the more exciting that you feel like, oh, that could be a really useful thing. Now, harvesting people's personal artwork online, that I'm not a big fan of at all.
Sure.
Just like what the actors are striking about, I feel like the same needs to happen with
I get
artists and their work.
I get it.
And, but hopefully once that can be either monetized for that artist that it's harvesting from,
Right.
there's a lot of wonder.
I agree. I mean, I've think about a lot. I think about a great deal, and I feel bad for some of how it has it affected people. But at the same time, it's like you put it on Instagram. By doing that,
Yes.
you kind of agreed to a bunch of
Right.
things that you may not have realized.
Yes, there was just a New York Times article about parenting, where the parents that have put their kids online in Facebook, and the parents that have chosen not to,
Right.
chose to respect that privacy.
Right.
And that there was this generative AI that was harvesting kids' faces and putting them onto actors that were proclaiming that they've just been kidnapped. Scary stuff.
Right.
And then using their voices because of all the videos that they had put online of their children.
Right.
And so that part of it is absolutely terrifying.
Right.
It really is. So meaning there needs to be some sort of structure. There needs to
Sure.
be some sort of parameters that safeguard all of this, but it's here to stay. Like there was a phrase that was used down in, I don't know where I heard it, but AI is not going to take your job, but someone who knows AI will.
Right.
And I believe that.
Right.
Like it's just going to be our future.
But we can also just look at Pixar, right? And it's when Pixar came around and Toy Story came out, they thought this is going to be the end of animation. But look how much more animation we have now than we ever did.
But it did. There was. I mean, like the 2D world
still thrives.
But there were a lot of people that had lost their jobs at that time.
Right.
You know, there was a slow decline, and there aren't as many 2D films for sure. But it survived, and it's still growing. It's just another way to tell a story.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Same thing with stop motion is still popular in some ways.
Yes.
So I think that people need to sort of look at history a little bit more and reflect on some of those things. Well, this is very exciting. So congratulations on the film. What's next for you?
Heading into development. I've been at work helping some other shows out right now. But going into development and hopeful for the future.
That's awesome. Well, thanks so much for doing this. It's wonderful sharing your story, both on screen and personally.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. Thanks, Chris. Thank you very much.
Take care.
Thank you.
Okay, so a couple last things.
Yeah.